The strangest twists of fate never knock on your door, they run straight into your heart when you least expect them. I never believed that until the afternoon a little boy looked up at me with calm blue eyes and smiled as if we were old friends. It happened outside St. Matthew Children's Center on a bright October afternoon, where golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk and parents hurried toward waiting SUVs and family sedans. I wasn't there for charity, despite what tomorrow's newspapers would probably claim. Men like me didn't survive by believing in good publicity. I was there because the foundation that carried my family's name had funded a new pediatric wing, and appearances were simply another kind of investment. My name was Adrian Romano. To the financial world, I was a billionaire investor. To the city, I was a respected philanthropist. To the people who whispered after I passed, I was something else entirely. They called me the Mafia Boss who owned half the skyline without ever putting his name on it. Expensive black SUVs lined the curb while my security team quietly scanned every face around me. Their tailored suits blended into the crowd, but their attention never rested. Mine rarely did either. Until I saw him. A small boy, maybe 7 years old, chased a bright red paper airplane across the courtyard. He wore a navy hoodie that was one size too big, worn sneakers with untied laces, and the kind of fearless smile only children seemed capable of keeping. The paper airplane caught a gust of wind and drifted directly toward me. Before anyone could react, the little boy hurried after it, bumping gently into my leg. My security team instinctively stepped forward, but I raised one hand without taking my eyes off the child. He picked up the airplane, brushed imaginary dust from it, then looked straight into my face. Most adults avoided my gaze. This boy didn't. Instead, he tilted his head with quiet curiosity, studying me as though he was searching for an old memory hidden behind my eyes. Then he smiled. "I know you," he said so naturally that it almost sounded like a greeting instead of a surprise. I couldn't help letting out the smallest laugh. "I'm afraid we've never met." He frowned for a second, not confused, just thoughtful. "No," he answered softly. "We did. A long time ago." The word settled somewhere deep inside me, stirring something I couldn't name. It was impossible. I had never seen this child before. At least, that's what logic insisted. But logic didn't explain the strange pull in my chest or the uncomfortable feeling that his voice had unlocked a door I didn't even remember closing. Before I could ask another question, I heard hurried footsteps. "Ethan," a woman's voice called, filled with panic and relief all at once. The boy turned toward the sound. I followed his eyes. A woman stood frozen near the entrance of the children's center, one hand gripping the strap of a worn leather bag. Her face had gone completely pale. For one endless second, neither of us moved. Then recognition crashed over me harder than any business loss or betrayal I'd ever survived. Emily Carter. The woman who had vanished from my life years ago without a single goodbye. And the moment her frightened eyes met mine, I knew she recognized me too. Emily did not hesitate. The moment our eyes met, she rushed toward Ethan with a speed that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with fear. She wrapped one arm around his shoulders, forcing a smile that fooled no one, especially not me. Time had changed her in ways I had never imagined. The carefree young woman who once laughed at expensive restaurants because she preferred food trucks and coffee from corner diners had become someone quieter. Stronger, somehow. There were faint lines near her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights rather than age, and she carried herself with the careful awareness of someone who had learned that peace could disappear without warning. Ethan looked up at her, confused by the sudden tension. "Mom, this is the man I told you about." Her fingers tightened gently around his shoulder. "We need to go, sweetheart." Her voice remained calm, but I caught the slight tremble beneath every word. "Emily." I spoke her name before I could stop myself. She froze. For just a second. Then she slowly turned back toward me. "It has been a long time." "Adrian." Hearing my name from her lips again felt strangely familiar, as though the missing years had folded into a single heartbeat. I searched her face for answers that refused to appear. "You disappeared." The words escaped quietly. They were not an accusation anymore. They were simply the truth I had carried for years. She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at me. Some stories end because they have to. And some deserve an explanation. She almost smiled, but sadness reached her eyes first. Not today. Ethan looked from her to me, completely unaware of the invisible conversation happening between us. Mom, how does he know your name? She brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. We met a long time ago. See? Ethan said proudly, pointing toward me. I told you I knew him. The innocence in his voice made something inside me shift. Children did not invent certainty like that. They believed what they felt. Emily gently touched his shoulder again. We are late. She started walking away, but Ethan suddenly turned back toward me and waved. Bye, Mr. Adrian. I watched them disappear through the parking lot until a silver crossover pulled away from the curb. I remained standing there long after the vehicle vanished into afternoon traffic. My head of security approached quietly. So? I kept watching the empty street. Find out where they have been living. He hesitated. He had worked for me nearly 10 years and knew when a request was personal instead of professional. Discreetly. Very. He nodded once before stepping away to make a call. I rarely look back once someone chose to leave my life. Business had taught me that every closed door eventually led somewhere else. But Emily had never felt like a closed door. She had always felt like a question left unfinished. As I walked toward my waiting vehicle, I replayed every second of that meeting in my mind. Ethan's smile. His voice. His eyes. Especially his eyes. They were impossibly familiar. Not because they looked like Emily's. They did not. They carried the same quiet blue that stared back at me every morning in my own reflection. I told myself it was coincidence. Genetics played strange tricks every day. Rational men accepted coincidences. Yet something deep inside me refused to let the thought go. By the time the black SUV merged into Manhattan traffic, I had already made a decision. I was not searching for the woman who disappeared years ago anymore. I was searching for the truth she had taken with her. The following morning I cancelled 3 meetings that had taken months to arrange. My board assumed a market shift had demanded my attention. They were wrong. For the first time in years, business had become secondary to a question I could not silence. My office occupied the top floor of Romano Tower, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan like a kingdom built from steel and glass. Normally the view cleared my mind. Today it only reminded me how small one unanswered mystery could make an entire city feel. A quiet knock interrupted my thoughts. Daniel stepped inside carrying a slim leather folder. He had protected me long enough to recognize when I wanted facts instead of conversation. He placed the folder on my desk without a word. I opened it slowly. Emily Carter. Age 32. Current address in Brooklyn. Elementary school volunteer twice a month. Freelance graphic designer working mostly from home. No criminal record. No outstanding debts. No social media beyond a private family account with almost no activity. It was as though she had deliberately erased herself from the world. I turned another page. Ethan Carter. 7 years old. Honor roll student. Excellent attendance. Baseball every Saturday morning. Piano lessons every Thursday afternoon. Pediatric checkups completed on schedule. Healthy. Happy. Loved by every teacher who had written about him. Then I reached the final page. Father. Blank. My fingers stopped moving. I read the line again. Blank. Not unknown. Not deceased. Simply blank. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling while memories I had buried years ago slowly returned. Emily had disappeared almost 8 years earlier without a letter, without a call, without giving me the chance to ask why. I had searched for months before convincing myself she had chosen another life. It had been the only explanation that allowed me to keep moving forward. Yet nothing in this folder matched the woman who would have walked away without a reason. Daniel quietly broke the silence. "There is one more thing, sir." He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a copy of Ethan's birth certificate obtained through legal public records. My eyes immediately found the date. I felt the air leave my lungs. The timing did not make sense. Ethan had been born only months after Emily vanished. I counted again, unwilling to trust my own memory. The numbers refused to change. Every calculation led to the same impossible conclusion. If the dates were accurate, then Emily had already been expecting a child before she disappeared from my life. I stood and walked toward the window, watching yellow taxis crawl below like tiny pieces on a chessboard. There had to be another explanation. Coincidences happened. Timelines overlapped. Assumptions ruined lives. That was what I kept telling myself. Even so, I could not ignore the image that refused to leave my mind. Ethan smiling at me outside the children's center. His calm blue eyes. The quiet confidence in his voice when he said we had met before. Children noticed truths adults learn to ignore. My phone buzzed softly against the desk. A calendar reminder appeared on the screen. Saturday. Brooklyn Community Baseball Field. Ethan Carter. Daniel had included the schedule because he believed every detail might matter. I stared at the reminder for several long seconds before pressing dismiss. Then I looked back at the birth certificate one final time. Deep inside, a feeling I had spent years suppressing slowly came back to life. I was no longer searching for answers about the past. I was beginning to fear that my entire future had been standing in front of me wearing a navy hoodie and holding a red paper airplane. Saturday mornings had once meant sleeping late and ignoring the outside world. Now I found myself standing beside a weathered chain-link fence at Brooklyn Community Baseball Field before 9 o'clock, wearing sunglasses that did little to hide who I was from the adults who occasionally glanced in my direction. Autumn. Sunlight stretched across the neatly cut grass while children laughed with the kind of joy money could never purchase. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from a small concession stand, mixing with the crisp air and the distant sound of a train passing overhead. I had attended championship boxing matches, billion-dollar negotiations, and political fundraisers where every word carried consequences. None of them made me feel as uncertain as watching a group of 7-year-olds chasing baseballs beneath a cloudless sky. Ethan stood near second base wearing an oversized blue jersey with the number 12 across his back. His cap kept sliding over his eyes, forcing him to push it back every few minutes. He was smiling almost constantly, cheering for teammates whether they succeeded or missed entirely. There was something disarming about the way he celebrated everyone else before thinking about himself. It reminded me of someone I had loved long ago. I stayed far enough away that Emily would not feel cornered if she noticed me. She sat on a folding chair near the dugout holding a travel mug and applauding every child equally, not only her own son. She looked peaceful for the first time since I had seen her again, although every few moments her eyes instinctively scanned the crowd as if making certain Ethan was safe. Old habits rarely disappeared. They simply became quieter. During the fourth inning, Ethan caught a routine ground ball, but his throw sailed past first base. Instead of hanging his head, he laughed at himself, chased after the ball, and kept running until everyone else was laughing too. Even the coach smiled. I found myself doing the same before realizing it. Daniel, standing several yards behind me, noticed immediately. "I have not seen you smile like that in years, sir." I did not answer because I was not certain I had either. When the game ended, families gathered around folding tables covered with juice boxes and homemade cookies. I started walking back toward the parking lot, deciding it was better to leave unnoticed than force another uncomfortable conversation with Emily. "Mr. Adrian." I turned before I even realized whose voice had called my name. Ethan was running toward me with his baseball glove tucked under one arm. He stopped a few feet away, breathing hard but grinning from ear to ear. "You came." I looked at him, surprised. You knew I would. He shrugged as though the answer were obvious. I hoped. Before I could respond, he reached into his backpack and carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made something for you. He handed it to me with complete confidence. Inside was a crayon drawing of 3 people standing beneath a bright blue sky. A tall man in a black suit. A woman with long blonde hair. A little boy holding both of their hands. Above them, written in uneven block letters, were 4 simple words. My happy family. My chest tightened. Children drew what they imagined, what they wished for, or what they somehow understood without explanation. I looked up to ask him about the picture, but Emily was already walking toward us, her expression filled with quiet concern the moment she saw the drawing in my hands. The color slowly disappeared from her face, and in that silent moment I realized she recognized the picture long before I understood why. Emily stopped a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the drawing as though it had become the most dangerous object in the park. Ethan looked between us, completely unaware of the silent conversation unfolding without a single word. Did you draw this today? I asked gently, careful not to let the questions racing through my mind reach my voice. Ethan nodded proudly. I finished it last night. Mom says families are the people who make you feel safe. He smiled up at me with complete sincerity. I think you make people feel safe too. The words caught me completely off guard. I had spent years building a reputation that depended on control, discipline, and influence. Safe was never the word strangers used to describe me. Before I could respond, Emily stepped closer and rested a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. Sweetheart, why do not you go thank Coach Miller before we leave? Ethan looked disappointed to walk away, but he nodded and ran toward the dugout with the same endless energy only children seem to possess. The moment he was out of earshot, Emily let out a slow breath. I am sorry, she whispered. He likes drawing stories that are not real. I looked down at the picture again. 3 people. 1 family. It felt less like imagination and more like memory. Children usually draw what they know, I said quietly. She looked away toward the baseball field where parents were folding lawn chairs and gathering backpacks. Sometimes they draw what they wish for. There was sadness in her voice, but also exhaustion, as if she had carried the same invisible weight for years. I folded the drawing carefully instead of putting it in my pocket carelessly. Emily, I have spent 8 years accepting that you left because you wanted another life. But nothing I have learned this week supports that. She closed her eyes for a brief second. Please, Adrian. Then help me understand. She shook her head slowly. If I tell you everything before you are ready, you will only ask questions that neither of us can answer today. I frowned. You think I am not ready? No. She finally looked directly into my eyes. I think you deserve the truth. I just need you to hear all of it instead of only the part that hurts. Those words lingered between us. Before I could speak again, she reached into her leather bag and removed a small white envelope. The edges were worn with age, as though it had been opened countless times. She held it in both hands for several seconds before offering it to me. I should have given you this years ago. I accepted it carefully. My name was written across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. Her handwriting. My pulse quickened as I opened the envelope. Inside was a faded photograph. Emily stood beside a lake wearing a loose cream-colored sweater, smiling with one hand resting gently against her stomach. I stared at the date printed in the corner. It had been taken less than 2 weeks before she disappeared. Behind the photograph rested a folded ultrasound image, protected inside clear plastic. I felt the world around me fade into silence. My eyes moved slowly from the scan to the date, then back again. Every number matched the birth certificate I had studied only days before. My hands remained perfectly still, but inside me everything shifted. Emily watched my expression without speaking. Tears shimmered in her eyes, yet she refused to let them fall. After several long seconds, she finally whispered the sentence that changed everything I believed about the past. I did not leave because I stopped loving you, Adrian. I left because someone convinced me that staying would destroy the life growing inside me. For several moments I could not speak. The sounds of children laughing, baseballs striking gloves, and parents calling to one another faded into something distant, as though the entire world had stepped back to leave only the two of us standing there. I looked again at the ultrasound image resting in my hands. It was real. It had always been real. Every year I had spent believing Emily chose to leave me suddenly felt built upon someone else's lie. I lifted my eyes to hers. Who told you that? She wrapped her arms around herself against the cool afternoon breeze. A man came to see me 2 days after you left for Europe on business. He said he worked for your family. He knew things nobody else could have known. He told me your world was becoming more dangerous, that your enemies would eventually use anyone you loved against you. Then he looked at me and said something I have never forgotten. Her voice grew quieter. If you truly love Adrian, disappear before your child ever learns his name. My chest tightened. I had never sent anyone to her. I had never asked anyone to make that choice for us. Why did you not call me? I asked softly. She looked down at the grass. I tried. She reached into her bag once more and pulled out an old cell phone with a cracked screen. Every call failed. Every message disappeared. A week later your apartment was empty, your office said you were unavailable, and someone began following me whenever I left my apartment. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was not. I stopped taking chances the day I realized I was responsible for more than myself. I closed my eyes for a brief second. Somewhere between those missing years, someone had quietly rewritten both of our lives. Before I could ask another question, Ethan came running back with his baseball cap tucked under his arm. Mom, Coach gave everybody ice cream coupons. He stopped beside us and smiled at me. Do you like chocolate? I could not help smiling back. Sometimes. Good, he said with complete confidence. Chocolate always makes people happier. Emily quickly brushed away the moisture gathering in the corner of her eyes before Ethan noticed. Would you like to thank Mr. Adrian for coming to your game? Ethan nodded enthusiastically. Thank you. Next Saturday I play again. You can come if you want. The invitation was so natural that it caught both of us by surprise. I glanced toward Emily. She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not trust. It was simply permission for one afternoon. I would like that, I answered honestly. Ethan grinned, then reached for my hand without hesitation as we walked toward the parking lot together. His small fingers wrapped around mine with effortless certainty, as though they had belonged there all along. Emily watched us from half a step behind. There was sadness in her expression, but for the first time since I had seen her again, I also caught something else. Hope. It was fragile, almost impossible to notice, yet it was there. I realized then that discovering the truth would not be the hardest part of this journey. The hardest part would be earning back the years that neither of us had chosen to lose. That night I sat alone in the library of my penthouse, surrounded by shelves filled with first editions and priceless antiques that suddenly felt meaningless. The ultrasound image lay on the desk beside Ethan's crayon drawing. One represented the life I had never known existed. The other showed the future a little boy had imagined without realizing how close it already was. I had spent years believing power could solve almost anything. Yet no amount of influence could return 7 birthdays, 7 Christmas mornings, or 7 years of bedtime stories that should have belonged to me. My phone rested beside the photographs. I stared at it for nearly an hour before finally calling the only person still alive who had served my family longer than anyone else. Vincent answered on the second ring. He had been my father's attorney and advisor for decades, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned. Adrian, he said warmly. It has been a while. I need to ask you something. The silence on the other end lasted just a fraction too long. Did someone ever approach Emily Carter while I was overseas? His breathing changed almost imperceptibly. "Why are you asking now?" "Because I finally found her." Another long silence followed. When Vincent finally spoke, his voice carried a heaviness I had never heard before. "Come see me tomorrow morning." He ended the call without another word. I barely slept. Before sunrise I drove alone to the small house where Vincent had retired after leaving the firm. He greeted me with tired eyes and invited me into a quiet study that smelled of old books and fresh coffee. Age had slowed his movements but not his mind. Without waiting for questions, he opened a locked drawer and removed a thick envelope sealed with dark blue wax. My name was written across the front in my late father's handwriting. "He ordered me to give you this only if Emily ever returned," Vincent said quietly. My hands felt strangely heavy as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. Every line became harder to read than the last. My father admitted he had learned about Emily's pregnancy before I did. He believed our family name would place unbearable pressure on a child and feared that enemies would eventually exploit anyone connected to me. Acting without my knowledge, he instructed trusted associates to convince Emily to disappear and arranged for every attempt she made to contact me to be quietly intercepted. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood alone. "I believed I was protecting my son, but I may have stolen his greatest joy instead." I lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak. Vincent looked at me with genuine regret. "Your father loved you more than his own reputation. He simply made the wrong choice." I closed my eyes. Anger never arrived. Only sadness. My father had not acted out of cruelty. He had acted out of fear, and fear had rewritten 3 lives. As I folded the letter back into the envelope, my phone vibrated. A message from Emily appeared on the screen. It contained only one sentence. "Ethan keeps asking when he will see you again." I stared at those words for a long time before smiling through eyes that suddenly refused to stay dry. For the first time in 8 years, the future no longer felt like something I had lost. It felt like something I still had a chance to earn. The following Saturday arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made every breath feel fresh. I reached the baseball field carrying nothing more than a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery and a quiet determination not to miss another moment that mattered. Ethan spotted me before I reached the fence. "You came," he shouted, waving both arms as though I had been a lifelong friend instead of a stranger who had only recently walked back into his world. I smiled and walked toward him. "I told you I would." He accepted the warm cinnamon rolls with the excitement only a 7-year-old could show, immediately insisting that I share one with him before practice began. Emily watched from nearby, a gentle smile replacing the guarded expression she had worn for so many years. It was small, almost cautious, but it was real. Practice passed quickly. I helped gather baseballs after drills, listened as Ethan explained the difference between every position on the field, and applauded every child who made a good play. Nobody treated me like a powerful businessman or whispered about my reputation. To the parents gathered around the diamond, I was simply another adult cheering for a little boy. It was strangely freeing. After practice, the 3 of us walked to a nearby park where orange and red leaves covered the pathways like a painted quilt. Ethan raced ahead toward a playground while Emily and I settled onto a wooden bench beneath a tall maple tree. For several minutes we simply watched him climb, laugh, and make friends with children he had never met before. Finally, Emily spoke. "He has asked about his father every birthday since he turned 4. I kept my eyes on Ethan. "What did you tell him?" "The truth that I could live with." She folded her hands together. "I told him his father was someone who would have loved him if life had given him the chance." I swallowed hard. "You gave me more grace than I deserved." She slowly shook her head. "No, Adrian. I gave you the grace I believed you would have shown me if our places had been reversed." Those words settled deep inside me because I knew she was right. Love had survived where certainty had failed. Ethan suddenly came running back toward us carrying a bright yellow kite another family had invited him to fly. "Come on," he laughed. "Both of you." Before either of us could answer, he grabbed one of my hands and one of Emily's, pulling us toward the open field with unstoppable determination. The wind caught the kite almost immediately, lifting it higher and higher into the brilliant blue sky. Ethan laughed so hard that several nearby families smiled just from hearing him. Then, without warning, he looked up at me with complete innocence. "Mr. Adrian?" "Yes?" He tilted his head thoughtfully. "Would it be all right if I stopped calling you Mr.?" Time seemed to slow. Emily looked at me, silently leaving the answer in my hands. I knelt until I was at Ethan's eye level. "You can call me whatever makes you comfortable." He smiled, thinking carefully for only a second before wrapping his arms around me in the kind of effortless hug only children know how to give. "Okay," he whispered. "I think I would like to call you family first, and maybe the other word when I am ready." In that moment I realized becoming a father was never about a name, a document, or even shared blood. It was about showing up again and again until a child's heart decided you had earned a place inside it. Winter arrived quietly that year, covering the city with the kind of gentle snowfall that softened even the hardest corners of Manhattan. Life did not transform overnight, and neither did we. Trust returned the way spring follows winter, one small day at a time. I stopped measuring success by contracts signed or buildings acquired. Instead, I found myself measuring weeks by baseball practices, piano recitals, and the afternoons Ethan insisted we spend building. Impossible towers from wooden blocks across the living room floor. Emily never rushed forgiveness. She did not have to. Every promise I made was followed by action instead of words. If I said I would be there at 4 o'clock, I arrived 15 minutes early. If Ethan invited me to school events, I cleared my calendar without hesitation. Somewhere along the way, routines replaced uncertainty. One evening, just before Christmas, Emily invited me to their apartment for dinner. It was small, warm, and filled with laughter that echoed off walls decorated with handmade drawings and family photographs. There were no crystal chandeliers or marble floors, only the comforting smell of homemade soup and fresh bread cooling on the kitchen counter. I had owned houses worth millions of dollars, yet I had never felt richer than I did sitting at that modest dining table. After dinner, Ethan disappeared into his bedroom and returned carrying the same drawing he had given me weeks earlier. The paper had become slightly wrinkled from being unfolded so many times. He placed it carefully between us before picking up a blue crayon. Without saying a word, he crossed out the words "my happy family" and slowly wrote something new beneath them. "My real family." Then he looked up at me with those familiar blue eyes and smiled. "I think it is finished now." My throat tightened so completely that I could barely answer. Emily reached across the table and quietly covered my hand with hers. There was no need for long speeches. The silence said everything our hearts had struggled to express for years. A few weeks later, on a bright January morning, the three of us stood together in a quiet attorney's office to complete the legal documents recognizing my parental rights. There were no television cameras, no reporters, and no celebration beyond the simple joy of making the truth official. When we stepped outside, Ethan slipped his small hand into mine just as naturally as he had at the baseball field months earlier. This time he looked up at me without hesitation. "Dad," he said, testing the word with a shy smile. "Can we get pancakes?" I laughed harder than I had in years. "Absolutely." Emily laughed too, shaking her head as snowflakes landed softly in her blonde hair. As we walked toward a neighborhood diner, I realized that the greatest inheritance my father had ever left me was not wealth, influence, or power. It was the chance to choose differently after learning from his mistake. The city still knew me as Adrian Romano, the wealthy man whose name carried influence wherever he went. But when one small boy reached for my hand and called me Dad, every title I had ever earned became insignificant beside that single word. Looking back now, I understand something I could never have learned from business or power. Secrets can separate hearts for years, fear can change the course of entire lives, and even love can lose its way when silence takes its place. But truth has a remarkable patience. It waits until we are finally ready to hear it, and when it arrives, it does not simply change the ending. Sometimes it gives a family the beginning they were meant to have all along.